So I wanted to share a little bit about Hanukkah history, some from Josephus and some from Maccabees. I'm going to be mixing it back and forth a little bit, because what's the difference? Well, the book of the Maccabees, we have actually 4 books of the Maccabees. Well, the ones that are most important for the study in the history of Hanukkah is the first one and the second one. They're actually completely different. If you can read them, the first one is all about the Maccabees, and it really kind of uplifts the whole Hasmonean family. It's all about them. But the second one, God is more involved, let's put it that way. Second Maccabees is really all about God making this happen in Israel, and the Maccabees are kind of in the middle of that. So the authors are different, the stories are different, even though the events they described are the same, and they kind of retell the same story, but they do it in a different way. Both books are interesting for their own reasons. I'll be primarily leaning on First Maccabees to help us the story. In fact, if you're curious, you can read the first 4 chapters of the First Maccabees, and you got the whole entire story right there, and nicely wrapped up. You know, if you want to read it through the 8 nights of Hanukkah, by the way, you can just go half a chapter at a time, and then by the last day, you've read the entire story of Maccabees in its complete, sort of sense, up to the liberation of the temple and rededication. So, this is from Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. This is from section 12. If you want to read that as well, that's where Josephus tells his version of the story. And Josephus takes his story from Maccabees. Why? Because the book of the Maccabees is written in the 1st century BCE. But Josephus lives in the 1st century CE. So he's already heard the story of Hanukkah told. He's already read those books. In fact, if you start comparing the text, he kind of steals a lot of it and just puts it into his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, because there's no point in rewriting the history. Somebody's already written it for him and did a pretty good job. But Josephus got his own ideas. He's writing to a Roman audience, and he's going to present a slightly different perspective to the Romans, whom he's trying to convince that Jews are a worthwhile people with very enlightened ideas, and Romans better listen up. So he's got his lie. So this is Antiquities of the Jews, section 12. It says Jesus changed his name to Jason. Well, Jesus, this is Yehoshua. Okay, so there was a priest named Yehoshua. He changed his name to Jason, but Ananias was called Menelaus. Now, as the former high priest, Jesus, or Yehoshua, raised sedition against Menelaus, who was ordained after him, the multitude were divided between them both, and the sons of Tobias took the part of Menelaus, but the greater part of the people assisted Jason. And by that means, Menelaus and the sons of Tobias were distressed, and retired to Antiochus, and informed him that they were desirous to leave the laws of their country and the Jewish way of living according to them, and follow the king's laws and the Grecian way of living. So this becomes the setting of the story. Remember, I told you Hanukkah is about political struggle. These are guys who are duking it out for the position of high priests. We have a very influential family, a Tobiah family, who are a priestly family. But one of their descendants is not old enough to take the priestly role. He's just a little one. So he can't lead. He cannot be the person in authority. So his position gets passed over to a relative who's older, who can actually be a leader. And that person leads for a while, but then the next thing that happens is a contender goes to Antiochus. And remember, at this time, Antiochus is in charge of Judea, because Alexander the Great conquered the whole entire Mediterranean. And Jews are nestled in between the Ptolemy kingdom in Egypt and Antiochus, the Seleucus, who set up his kingdom in Syria, and Jews are right in the middle. So they're constantly contending for that land. And so at that moment, they go to Antiochus, so he's in charge. They say, I would like to be the high priest, please. And here's a nice bribe. So he makes him a priest. At that point, the guy who lost the priestly job goes to Antiochus and says, I can do better. Here's my bribe. Okay, you're the priest now. I want you to realize this is what's going on. In that culture, the priesthood became for sale. Because Antiochus didn't care that you have to be the descendant of Aaron. He didn't care that you have to be next in line. He didn't care about Jewish laws or traditions. He's like, he gave me more money. He's the priest now. It's that simple. So you have these people duking it out. Menelaus and Ananias, and there's these confederacies now of who is going to be the priest. Now, of course, you realize the big deal is in that time, the priest runs pretty much everything, because if you run the temple, you run the whole country. Remember, there's no kings in Israel at that moment, because Antiochus, he rules from Syria through his vassals, through people who serve him. And so if he appointed them, they toe his line. And what's amazing is that these people come to Antiochus, they complain. This is how he gets involved, by the way. They come to him and they say, we want to follow the Greek ways. We want to leave the Jewish ways behind. We are ready to become Greeks, just like the whole world has become Greeks. We're finally ready to become Greeks. And of course, Antiochus is very happy about it, because that's the whole idea of Hellenization. If all the people are Hellenized, if everybody speaks Greek and worships the same gods, then it's very easy to unite people. But you have this tiny little group of stubborn people who don't want to worship the same God you worship, and in fact, they have their own ways about food and pretty much everything in life. They're hard to govern. They're hard to deal with. They're obstinate. And they keep having notions of freedom, too, from time to time. So here you have Antiochus, and they come to him and they say, we want to follow king's laws. We want to be Greeks. Can you make it happen? And that's how Antiochus gets in the middle of that fight. Because remember, this is a power struggle for priesthood. And Antiochus now comes in the same way that Romans later come in. They're being asked to join a conflict and take a side. Remember, we've been studying earlier the days of the prophets, and we talked about how Assyria got involved in the affairs of Israel. They've been asked for help. King Sargon came and did help the kingdom of Judah. But then later, his descendant came to try to conquer the kingdom of Judah. Because the moment you get the foreign powers involved in your politics, they realize that they can somehow muscle you out. And that's what happens. And that's exactly what happened in this story with Antiochus. So they wanted to go Greek. So Josephus continues. Wherefore, they desired his permission to build them a gymnasium at Jerusalem. And when they had given them leave, they also hid the circumcision of their genitals. Even when they were naked, they might appear to be Greeks. Accordingly, they left off all the customs that belonged to their country and imitated the practices of other nations. Now, this is Josephus writing about this. Now, a lot of time people give Josephus flack, but you have to realize Josephus is actually a proud Jew. And he always toes the Jewish line, even if he's writing for Romans. And he might be nice to Romans, but he always really gets on Greeks, because Romans didn't like Greeks either. So, he talks about what happens in the culture. Gymnasium. What's gymnasium all about? It's all about Olympic Games, right? It's all about competing, sports. And that time, it was all men, and they were all nude. So a small part of the anatomy that needed to be altered, people went through very, very painful surgeries. I can't even begin to imagine what they might have done to reverse the process. Yes, these were the surgeries that people did. We do have medical records talking about those things that were done. But that's how much they wanted to be Greeks. That's how far they were willing to go. So this is the story of apostasy that is also described in the book of Maccabees in almost the same language. It talks about these people wanting to go the Greek way, all the way, even to the point of reversing circumcision. Josephus continues. Now it came to pass after years in the 145th year of the 25th day of the month, which by us is called Kislev, and by Macedonians Apelius. In the 153rd Olympiad, he has to throw that in for reference, that the king came up to Jerusalem. Pretending peace, he got possession of the city by treachery, at which time he spared not so much as those that admitted him into it on account of the riches that lay in the temple, but led by his covetous inclination, for he saw that there was a great deal of gold and many ornaments that had been dedicated to the very great value. In order to plunder its wealth, he ventured to break the league he had made. This is Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV is on conquest. Remember, these parts of the great empire of Alexander constantly trying to take territory from each other. And Syrian king is marching down to Egypt to annex however much of Egypt he can. And so war is expensive. You got to pay for it. What happens next? He needs to resupply. He needs to pay his troops. All these financial pressures. And he comes to Jerusalem. And what do they have in the temple? Lots of gold. Lots of gold. You guys study the temple. You know what's inside, right? All these items are made out of gold. They're all very costly. So he comes into the city under the pretense of goodwill. I am, just coming by, sort of say. I need to resupply. My army is marching. Of course, he marches with the troops, but as they let him in, he says, okay, now all this stuff is mine. And he starts taking things from the temple. Why? Because he needs them. He wants them. It's too much to pass by. There's so much gold that they have over here in the temple. So essentially, Josephus tells us a story of how the riches of the temple really tempt him, and he says that he breaks the league he made. So he already has a deal with the people that he left in charge, right? The very priests that bribed him to get the priesthood. He made a deal that you can have what you need as long as you keep paying taxes, but now he sees all this gold and he can't pass it by. That's just not enough. So he's going to take it all. And he's willing to throw away the deal that he made. He's willing to throw away that stability. And that's exactly what Josephus tells us he did. So he says, then he left the temple bare and took away the golden candlestick and the golden altar of incense, the table of showbread, and the altar of burnt offering. He did not abstain even from the veils, which were made of fine linen and scarlet. He also emptied out the secret treasures, left nothing at all remaining by his means, that cast Jews into great lamentation. And then it gets worse. Not enough that he stole everything from the table that he could steal. The temple is empty. He says he forbade them to offer those daily sacrifices which were used to offer God according to the law. And when he had pillaged the whole city, some of the inhabitants he slew, and some he carried captive together with their wives and children, so that the multitude of those captives that were taken alive amounted to about 10,000. He also burnt down the finest building, and then he had overthrown the city walls. He built a citadel in the lower part of the city, for the place was high, and he overlooked the temple, on which account he fortified it with high walls and towers, and put into it a garrison of Macedonians. So not only he robbed the temple, and not only he forbade them to worship the way they were supposed to worship, he actually put his army base right there in Jerusalem to keep them in line. Now he has a garrison stationed in the fortress right there. In case the people get out of hand, the soldiers can come out and punish them all and wreak more havoc. And they can hold out in that fortress. So basically, that's the story of Hanukkah. This is how it all begins. I told you, it's a story of struggle. It's a story of conflict. It's about wars. It's about blood being spilled. As we keep reading the story of Hanukkah, that's really all it's about. It's not the kind of stories you tell children when you're saying Mao's tour next to the Menorah. This is scary stuff. This is hard. This is harsh reality of what Hanukkah is really about. Okay? It is a story of struggle. And now, a story of religious persecution. Because now people have invited him in, and he's going to force them to become Greeks. And that's what the book of Maccabees is going to continue to tell us about now all the forced sacrifices to the pagan gods and worship of deities that they did not know. And then when the king built an idol, altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice neither according to the law nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled them to forsake the worship which they paid their own God, and to adore those who he took to be gods, and made them build temples and raise idol altars in every city and village, and offer swine upon them every day. He also commanded them not to circumcise their sons, and threatened to punish any that should be found to have transgressed this injunction. He also appointed overseers, who should compel them to do what he commanded. This is the beginning of what we would know as the Maccabean Revolt. Because as the pressure was put upon the people to abandon their ancestral ways, some would rise up to fight these decrees. Some would rise up against Antiochus. But the stuff that's happening here, we know from other books that he did set up an image right there in the temple. And he did sacrifice upon the holy altar the things that were unholy. And this was abomination. In fact, if you're curious, look up Josephus. He actually ties this to Daniel. I'm not going to read that passage today to kind of keep us on the Hanukkah story, because then I'm going to get sidetracked into prophecy and everything else. But he actually does call that abomination. He quotes Daniel. Josephus knows his Bible pretty good. So that what he sees going on over there, he says, this is what Daniel talked about. Very clear line. And the story just gets worse, honestly. This gets worse. It says, and indeed many Jews that were compelled with the king's commands, either voluntarily or out of fear of the penalty that was denounced, but the best men and those with noblest souls did not regard him, but did pay a greater respect to the customs of their country than concern as to the punishment which he had threatened to the disobedient, on which account they every day underwent great miseries and bitter torments. For they were whipped with rods, and their bodies were torn to pieces, and they were crucified while they were still alive and breathed. They also strangled those women and their sons whom they had circumcised, as the king had appointed, hanging their sons about their necks as they were upon the crosses. And if there were any sacred books of the law found, it was destroyed, and those with whom they were found miserably perished also. Like I said, it gets worse. These are the types of things that we read about. This is not just religious persecution. This is like Holocaust. This is genocide. This is awful. The torture that they're describing is not just inhumane. It is meant to denigrate you to the level beyond anything you can imagine. I mean, so yeah, you see, like crucifixion, and when we think about crucifixion and being crucified alive, this is how far back it goes. It goes way before Romans. They did do that. They hanged people alive and basically slowly let them die and waste away over a period of time. What an awful thing to do. So, we get on Romans for their cruelty. This is what the Syrian Greeks, the Hellenists, call them whatever you want them. That's what they're doing. This is what Antiochus is doing. And by the way, I'm reading to you Josephus. This is first century account. This is his essentially retelling of the book of the Maccabees. I like Josephus because his account is more compact. The book of Maccabees still tell the same stories. They're just spread out all over the place, so I have to hip and skop a lot just to kind of get to those places. So here I'm just nicely confounded to a short story. But they're all true. So maybe you've read some of the books of the Maccabees and you remember some of the tortures that are being described there. And the further you read, like when you read second Maccabees, it gets worse, and you get to the next third and fourth, there's even more stuff that's described. So again, those books are not necessarily all written by the same author. They're not like part one, part two, part three. They're different renditions of the same stories, not always entirely in agreement with each other, but they all tell the same historical events. So this is pretty scary stuff. But here's the amazing part. All this was brought on by people striving for authority, power. Those men that wanted to be priests, that went to bribe the local king, and then got him involved in their political struggle, saying, better yet, forget about the money. We want to become Greeks. Help us out. And then he comes in, and he helps them out. Unfortunately, that's not the kind of help they were probably thinking about. But by then, it's too late. What are you going to do? This guy has an army. And that's how the story of Hanukkah unfolds. Of course, you know what happens next. Next comes the uprising.